Breaking all survival rules in the wild, a lonely man in Alaska led a freezing mother bear and her cubs onto his porch. No one could have imagined the shocking consequences of this encounter. The thermometer outside Jack Frost's cabin showed 40 degrees below zero, and the temperature was still dropping. In the 5 years Jack had lived in this remote part of Alaska, he had never seen the cold be so merciless. The approaching storm wasn't just another winter challenge. It was something that made even the toughest wilderness dwellers question their choices. Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, 4 hours away from the nearest town, stood a lonely wooden cabin, the home of a former wildlife photographer who had left his career in Seattle for a secluded life. On that freezing day, listening to the wind howling through the pine trees, Jack truly wondered for the first time if his decision to live here had been a terrible mistake. The February morning started like any other. Jack woke up to the familiar crackling of wood in the fireplace, the heat from the dying embers barely reaching the corners of his small living room. Through frost-covered windows, he could see that fresh snow had fallen overnight, adding another layer to the already deep drifts. At 45 years old, Jack had developed a strict daily routine that helped him survive in these harsh conditions. Every morning he checked the weather radio, took stock of his supplies, and made sure his equipment was in good shape. The walls of his cabin were covered with photographs he had taken over the years. Images of wolves, moose, and bears in their natural habitat were his silent companions in solitude. His pictures had once been published in the biggest wildlife magazines, but after his wife's death 3 years ago, Jack left everything behind to start a new life far from civilization. That morning's weather forecast made him especially uneasy. A storm was coming from the north, bringing winds strong enough to knock down trees and a cold that could break records. Jack knew that in such conditions, he could be trapped inside for days, maybe even weeks. He spent the entire day securing the generator and checking his backup heating system. In Alaska, one small mistake could be deadly. His father's old saying echoed in his mind, "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son." Those words had helped him survive more times than he could count. By evening, the first wave of the storm hit the cabin with relentless force. Snow fell like a solid white wall, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few steps from the porch. Jack threw more logs into the fireplace and started his usual storm preparations. His satellite phone, the only reliable connection to the outside world, was fully charged and lay on the table next to his emergency radio. The nearest ranger station was 30 miles away, and in this weather, help would be impossible for days if something went wrong. As night fell, the storm grew stronger. The wind seeped through every crack in the cabin walls, making an eerie whistling sound that Jack had never quite gotten used to. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Suddenly, through the howling wind, a sound reached Jack's ears, making him jump from his chair. A deep, guttural noise, barely audible through the storm, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years photographing wildlife. A bear, and very close to the cabin. In February, bears should be in deep hibernation. The fact that one was awake and active in these conditions meant something was terribly wrong. Jack grabbed his flashlight and carefully moved toward the window. The beam of light barely cut through the thick snow, but visibility was still poor. The thermometer now showed -45 degrees, and with the wind chill, it was even colder. Then he saw them, 3 dark shapes moving through the white haze. A mother bear and her 2 cubs struggling through the deep snow. Even from inside the cabin, Jack could tell they were fighting for their lives. The mother's usual strong gait had turned into a slow, exhausted shuffle, and the cubs pressed against her, struggling against the biting wind. Years of observing wildlife had taught Jack to read animal behavior, and what he saw deeply disturbed him. The mother bear was desperate. Only extreme circumstances would force a mother to bring her cubs out in such deadly cold. Something must have disturbed their den, forcing them into this life-threatening storm. The bears reached the cabin, seeking shelter from the merciless wind. In the flashlight's beam, Jack saw that their fur was covered in a thick layer of ice. The cubs were shivering violently, their small bodies not built for such extreme cold. The mother bear's movements were becoming weaker. Her strength was fading fast. Jack's heart pounded wildly as the bears came closer to his porch. This was exactly the kind of situation all wilderness survival guides warned about. Bears near human buildings were dangerous under normal circumstances, but this situation was far from normal. A desperate mother bear would do anything to protect her cubs. Now Jack could clearly see the bears through the window. The cubs were much smaller than they should have been, likely born late in the season. Their chances of surviving the night were almost zero. The mother bear began digging at the snow near the porch, trying to make some kind of shelter, but the wind destroyed her efforts in seconds. The temperature kept dropping. Even the liquid inside the thermometer had frozen. The wind grew stronger, and Jack watched as the mother bear desperately tried to shield her cubs with her body. One of the cubs stumbled and sank into the deep snow. The mother carefully lifted it, but the cubs' movements were growing slower. The cubs had been fighting to stay alive for almost an hour, and their condition was getting worse. The second cub collapsed, and this time, it took much longer to get back up. The mother bear's attempts to help them were becoming weaker. Her own strength was fading. She let out a low moan, a sound full of despair that cut through the howling wind and sent a chill deep into Jack's soul. The bears now huddled against his porch in a last attempt to find some kind of protection from the wind. The cubs were barely moving, and the mother bear's eyes had turned glassy from the cold. In the flashlight's beam, Jack noticed their shivering had become less frequent, a dangerous sign of hypothermia. Jack's hand rested on the door handle. Everything he knew about wilderness survival, every rule he had followed for years, told him to stay inside. But the bears on his porch were slowly freezing to death. And what was the value of survival rules compared to living creatures dying in front of him, needing help? The cubs had almost stopped moving. The mother bear was desperately trying to cover them from the cold and wind with her body. Her eyes met Jack's through the window, and in that moment, he saw something that shook him to his core. There was no aggression in her gaze, only exhaustion, desperation, and something eerily close to surrender. Attached to his cabin was a storage room where he kept his photography equipment. It was well insulated, separate from the main living space, and had its own entrance. It could serve as a temporary shelter, but bringing 3 freezing bears inside was madness. The risk was enormous. A panicked bear could destroy the cabin, leaving Jack stranded in the storm with no protection. The cubs had stopped moving completely. Only the faint rise and fall of their chests showed they were still alive. The mother bear's eyes started closing, and her massive body slowly sank into the snow. A few more minutes, and it would be too late. Jack turned on all the heaters in the storage room, making it as warm as possible. He laid blankets near the door, ready to act. The mother bear watched his every move through the window, her gaze following each step he took. In that moment, Jack no longer saw a dangerous predator. He saw a mother fighting with everything she had left to save her children. The wind howled louder, and the temperature kept dropping mercilessly. The clock showed 2 a.m., the coldest, darkest hour of the night. Jack took one last deep breath and turned the door handle. The door creaked open, the sound deafening in the frozen night. The wind rushed in, carrying snow and biting cold into the cabin. The bears were only a few steps away, their bodies half buried in the growing snowdrifts. Moving slowly, deliberately cautious, Jack stepped onto the porch. The mother bear's eyes gleamed as she registered his presence, but she made no aggressive move. It seemed her survival instincts were battling her exhaustion. She lifted her head slightly, her nostrils flaring as she caught his scent. Speaking in a quiet, calm voice, Jack began clearing a path from the porch to the storage room door. Every movement was slow and non-threatening. "It's okay," he whispered, though he knew the bears wouldn't understand his words. The mother bear watched him, but she didn't show aggression. The cubs remained motionless, their small bodies almost completely covered in snow. Time was running out. In this weather, even these few minutes outside were dangerous for Jack. He had to act now or abandon the idea completely. With trembling hands, he threw the storage room door wide open. Warm air spilled into the freezing night, instantly creating a mist. The mother bear lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as she smelled the heat. It was the strongest movement she had made in the past hour. Jack's heart pounded as he dared to step closer to the bears, holding blankets in his hands. The mother bear followed his movements, but her protective instincts seemed dulled by the cold and exhaustion. When he was just a few yards away from the cubs, he carefully draped a blanket over them. The mother bear tensed for a moment, and Jack held his breath, knowing that his life depended on her next reaction. But instead of attacking, she slowly began sniffing the blanket wrapped around her cubs, as if she understood its purpose. Jack spread another blanket closer to the storage room door, creating a warm path. His fingers were going numb, and he realized he couldn't stay outside much longer. Everything now depended on the mother bear's next move. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled from weakness. The cubs remained motionless under the blanket. With gentle movements, the mother bear nudged one of her cubs, but it didn't respond. A sorrowful moan escaped her throat, a mother's fear for her children cutting through the howling wind. Jack backed toward the storage room door. The warm air flowing from the open doorway was an irresistible promise of life in the deadly cold. The huge creature gathered its last bit of strength. With great effort, the mother bear managed to rise, every movement visibly painful. For a moment she stood, swaying in the wind, her gaze shifting from her cubs to the open door. Then with infinite tenderness, she gripped the blanket in her teeth and began pulling her cubs toward the door. The blanket helped them slide over the snow, but each step drained her precious energy. Her powerful muscles trembled with effort, but her motherly instinct pushed her forward. The distance was only a few steps, but it felt like miles. Jack stood perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as the bear family slowly made their way towards safety. Finally, they reached the doorway. At the entrance, the mother bear paused. Her massive figure filled the doorway, steam rising from her fur as the warmth of the room met the freezing air. This was the most dangerous moment. If she panicked now in such a small space, there would be no escape. But the overwhelming cold and her desperate need to save her cubs overcame her natural fear. Using the last of her strength, she pulled her cubs over the threshold into the warm room. Jack watched as the enormous creature collapsed beside her cubs, wrapping her body around them as warmth began to return to their frozen bodies. With utmost caution, Jack closed the storage room door. Through the small window, he could see the bears huddled together, seeking the life-saving heat. The mother bear's eyes remained open, watching him. But as the warmth seeped through her frozen fur, the tension in her body began to fade. For the next several hours, Jack stayed awake, watching through the window that connected his living space to the storage room. The storm outside reached its peak, shaking the cabin walls. But inside, something incredible was happening. The cubs were the first to show signs of life. As their little bodies warmed, they began to move. At first, their movements were weak and barely noticeable, but slowly they grew stronger. The mother bear sniffed each cub, as if bringing them back to life. By sunrise, the cubs were awake and moving, their natural curiosity returning. They stayed close to their mother, but with each hour, their movements became more playful. The storm raged for 2 more days. During that time, Jack carefully placed water and food near the storage room door while the bears rested. The mother bear accepted these offerings, her initial wariness replaced with cautious acceptance of his presence. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally passed. The world outside had transformed into a crystal-clear landscape of snow and ice, but the temperature had begun to rise. For the first time in days, the sun peeked through the clouds. Jack knew the time had come. The bears needed to return to the wild. As if sensing this, the mother bear became more restless, her instincts calling her back to the forest. With the same careful movements he had used on that desperate night, Jack opened the outer door of the storage room. Fresh air and sunlight flooded in, and the mother bear lifted her head, sensing the change. She got to her feet, once again strong and magnificent. Nothing like the desperate creature she had been 3 nights ago. At the doorway, she paused. She turned her head toward Jack, who stood at a respectful distance. Their eyes met one last time, and in that moment, there was a strange understanding between them. Then, with surprising grace, she led her cubs out into the snow. Jack watched as they moved toward the forest, their dark shapes growing smaller against the vast white landscape. Before disappearing into the trees, the mother bear stopped and looked back one final time. Then she turned and vanished into the wilderness with her cubs, leaving only a trail of paw prints in the snow. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable encounter. On a warm August day, Jack was returning to his cabin after a rare trip to town for supplies. His old pickup truck grumbled as it made its way along the winding mountain road. After the harsh winter, The past few months had been filled with frequent photography sessions, capturing nature awakening once more. As he rounded a bend, a massive bear suddenly stepped onto the road. Jack slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded and came to a stop just inches from a large tree. Gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled fingers, Jack stared at the enormous creature blocking the road. The bear stood motionless, looking straight at him. "What the hell?" Jack whispered, trying to calm his racing heart. Something about the bear's stance seemed familiar. Could it really be her? No, that was impossible. But the longer he looked, the more convinced he became. It was the same mother bear he had saved during the winter. But why was she standing in the middle of the road? Why wasn't she going back into the forest? Jack restarted the engine, hoping the sound would scare her off. But the bear didn't move. Then a strange rumbling filled the air. Jack felt the ground beneath his truck begin to tremble. The mother bear turned her head, looking towards something ahead, then back at Jack. There was a strange tension in her eyes. A sudden crash made Jack jump. Just a few dozen yards ahead, a massive chunk of rock broke away from the overhanging cliff and crashed onto the road with a thunderous impact. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the road ahead was buried under an impassable pile of rocks and dirt. If not for the bear's sudden appearance, Jack would have been caught right in the middle of it. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. The animal hadn't been trying to attack. The mother bear had intentionally stopped his truck, saving him from certain death, risking her own life in the process. As the rock slide came to an end, the bear turned and slowly walked toward the edge of the road. She stopped at the tree line. From behind the trees, two young bears appeared. They looked strong and healthy, their fur shining in the sunlight. The mother bear cast one last glance at Jack, then led her cubs into the forest. Jack sat in his truck, staring at the blocked road ahead and the spot where the bear had just stood. Life in Alaska had taught him many lessons about survival, but this was perhaps the most important one of all. Sometimes gratitude in the wild comes from where you least expect it. Jack turned his truck around and slowly took the long way home. This was a moment worth saving, not just on the film of his camera, but deep within his soul.